Hello and welcome to Tipsy Tolstoy, Russian literature for the inebriated.
I'm Matt Gerasimovich, PhD student in Russian Lit. This week, slowly but surely, contemplating how to fill the picture frames on my walls that sit behind me empty with each episode, slowly enticing the reader to wonder, what will he put in them next week? What will the collection grow to?
I'm waiting with bated breath to see what goes in there.
Yeah. I mean, I know what I'm going to put in them, but I'm just too lazy to actually do it.
Isn't that the way of things?
Mm-hmm.
I have an entire pile of pictures which have been sitting next to my chair for like, I'm going to say a solid 4 months that I have the command strips. I have the pictures. I just need to put them up. And yet here I am. Not putting
Isn't
them
it
up.
more fun when they kind of sit in like a cluttered pile by the side of your desk though?
Yeah, it's kind of fun. People come over and you show them, here's what could be in my walls. This is what could make this area look a little nicer.
It lets them know that you have untapped potential though.
Exactly. Well, I'm Cameron Lalana, and this week I have had a very quiet New Year's, not to date our episode, but because we are sheltering in place, because be careful what you wish for. California's been in drought for like the last 20 years, and really apparently either we get drought or we get flooding. So because of shelter in place orders, I am now stuck in place, and I can leave my apartment, but I can look out the window right now and see the trees are shifting because of the wind outside. And when my iPhone is like, hey, there's like 50-mile-an-hour winds outside, I think maybe I should believe it.
Sure.
Yeah.
I just think you're kind of lucky because I was thinking for a really long time before this podcast about what I was going to say for this week, and I had to pick kind of a cop-out one because my state doesn't give me freebies like that. It's too bad.
That's the fun one.
It's good.
That's one of the fun things about California. Just sunshine, kombucha, natural disaster. It's just another day in the big Fornia, as we say.
Yep. Yeah, Illinois, their like tourism slogan they're trying to brand now is the center of everything, which is such a fucking lie. But California, it could be like center of the disaster.
I think California's is, hey, we're ready for an earthquake. Don't ask about the other ones.
Yeah, the Illinois tourism commercial, it shows Springfield, Illinois, and Abraham Lincoln's ghost like jumping out at some tourists, and I can't imagine like they had Lincoln in I guess nothing since. What will get people to Middle America? I don't know. Lincoln?
At least Ohio has like 5 presidents for some reason. Sorry to any Ohioans out there. I respect your state and the 5 presidents and whatever else you've contributed to U.S.
I, on the other hand, don't. I don't think you all comprise a very high number of our audience members, so I can safely say that. Mm-hmm.
I've got to walk a fine line as the coastal elite here. Whereas, yeah, Matt is also the coastal elite, but I mean, not to throw you under the bus here, but you are from Florida, so I don't think anyone includes Florida in the coastal elite typically.
No, they don't. I'm more of a swamp elite.
Mm-hmm, that's right.
Mm-hmm. Anyways, welcome on into our little podcast. Tipsy Tolstoy, the center of the disaster. Maybe that should be our slogan.
That should be.
It's a podcast. This is me and my good pal Cameron, and we like to unwind from our weeks by talking about some Russian literature and taking a drink or two while we do it. This fine evening, we're going to continue our journey through Tolstoy's War and Peace, which if you are on episode 3, you probably know that already. But in case you didn't, we are tackling part 3 of book 1. We got a juicy one for you today. This was a great part.
I know part 1 is all about peace, part 2 is all about war, and now it's time to bring them together.
Well, kind of.
Well, they happen in the same part.
They happen in the same part, but this one is more about sending Tolstoy to horny jail.
We'll talk about that one in a little bit.
Unfortunately.
For now, we want to remind you all that this series is only possible because of the support of our generous listeners who chip in a little bit every month at patreon.com/tipsytolstoy. And as a thank you to all of them, we're going to be hosting a monthly Patreon-only reading group to discuss more of the important passages we didn't get to cover in our episode. If you want to get the most out of this series and our podcast, take a look at patreon.com/tipsytolstoy. If you're not interested in Patreon but still want to help us out, you can leave us a nice review on Apple Podcasts or sign up for our email list on our website, tipsytolstoy.com.
Speaking of patrons, we wanted to give a quick shout out to our newest patron, JG. Thank you so much for supporting the podcast. And for anyone else who's interested in supporting the lads at Tipsy Tolstoy, feel free to take a look over at patreon.com/Tipsy Tolstoy. And you can actually have your review featured on our Instagram now. I've started a new segment called 5-Star Fyodor, where I will take reviews that I think are funny and also that give us 5 stars, hence the name. And I'll put a little Instagram post for you. So it's pretty fun.
There we go. You can get involved too.
If that doesn't entice you, I don't know what will.
Yes, that is true. Before we get into talking about war, peace, horny jail, Matt, I got to ask you, what are you drinking today?
Well, as you all know, I'm on that non-alcoholic bender, as I'm describing it. I'm getting into the non-alcoholic spirits now, which, as I described to Cameron before the show, it's basically just flavored water, but a little bit bitter, I guess. I am tonight drinking. I actually like it. I poke fun, but I like it. I'm drinking a brand called Seedlip. It's a non-alcoholic spirit. The spirit is called Grove 42. It has distilled citrus botanicals, and it's a pretty one. I got it in my fancy boy glass. I've mixed it with some elderflower tonic water, and I, for the first time in so long in this podcast, actually have a good drink.
There you go, and it's nice, herbal, refreshing.
Yeah,
for all of our abstaining Akhmatovas out there.
That's right. That's right.
That's right.
You can be an abstaining Akhmatova and still have fun, baby. What have you got on the other side of town there?
Sure. So mine's a little harder to get. Definitely, if you are ever want to try the drinks we have, I'd recommend Matt's this week. Because for Christmas, I got for my sister a Beers of the World pack, and to my immense delight, I found
I didn't get one.
Yours is still in the mail. She asked me to pass on her apologies to you about not getting it ahead of time.
Sure.
I have a good old cerveza Alhambra 1125. My Spanish is not so good anymore.
Did you study abroad?
I don't think I've ever brought that up before. It's been a long time trying to erase the Southern Spaniard out of my Spanish. Anyway, so this is there's a brewing company in southern Spain, Alhambra beer, as reference to the Alhambra, which is the town where it's brewed. And when I was living there, man, I drank so much Alhambra beer, and it's such a blast from the past to be able to have this back. I think I had it in the podcast a while back. I found it at a store, but it's not super common that I actually see it around here. So I was overjoyed, and hard to find, but if you can, I'd highly recommend it. It's a great cheap beer.
That sounds good.
Mm-hmm. Anyway, so War and Peace Part 3, the end of book 1 of 4. Man, it's really hard to talk about what part we're in without being confusing.
It's extremely confusing.
So in this one, we have, like we said, bit of war, bit of peace, a lot of horny jail, which we'll be getting into. Before we start talking about the actual events, Matt, is there anything you want to touch on?
No, not really. I think
Sounds good.
This is just a funny part. That's all I wanted to touch on. I was actually laughing rereading this. I think this was the funniest of the 3 that we have read so far.
Easily.
Yes. And I got a lot of really good quotes to discuss after the summary.
Perfect. Me too. So I'm ready to get into it. Let's go over pretty fast because there's a lot to get into here.
Yeah, it's not a chapter, I don't think, where you need to get bogged down in the specifics, because there's just going to be like a lot of generals, and they all have Eastern European names, and who cares?
Yeah.
Half of them are going to die in like 3 pages, so it's like, okay.
Just, note them, carry on.
Sure.
As you might recall last time, I don't remember if this is how it ended, but more or less we finished up on the death of Count Bezukov, and now Pierre, who has been the inheritor of all his goods, his possessions, his 40,000 souls, so they say, is now suddenly a count. And everyone who before looked down at him or considered him annoying or was like, this guy is an affront to our society, suddenly they're all very nice to him. And in fact, Prince Vasily has taken over his affairs and making sure to set things in order. And it says, hey, this is such a good thing I'm doing for you. And it's noted that it's not really that he's consciously thinking about how he is making himself indebted to the new Count Bezukov or Pierre. But he's not thinking about it. He's just not thinking about it systematically. So one of the things that he's doing here is also trying to maneuver Pierre into marrying his daughter, Helena, Lelia. You'll see her referred to as a lot of ways. She's the one who he also will not stop talking about how beautiful she is, which is part of.
He's doing a little bit more than maneuver, and I'd say she is quite literally backing it up in this part.
Yeah, Yeah. So after after he gets Pierre to kind of pay off everyone involved in the affair, the embarrassing affair of Bezukhov's death, to avoid any issues to the tune of some number of thousands of rubles, they move him from Moscow to Petersburg society as they're preparing his house for him to move into, and Pierre is staying with Count Vasily. He's going to a lot of soirees where suddenly he is, a valued guest, and also at one of these soirees at Anna Pavlovna, who you may recall as the woman whose soiree we open the book on, she kind of brings him and Helena together. And as they're talking, he's always been told she's beautiful, and he always agrees, like, yes, she's very beautiful. Now, I forget the exact circumstances, but they lean in close to discuss something, or so we can see something, and he begins to notice how close he is to her, and we get a real extended monologue about him thinking about her body, and it's real uncomfortable to read.
Didn't like it.
Didn't like it. I don't like it whenever Tolstoy gets horny. Nope. Will not be reading any particular quotes unless you would like to discuss them, Matt, because I don't want to think about Tolstoy being horny, but it is like maybe one or two descriptive, like a little more. If it was only slightly more particular, I'd be like, well, this is like old erotica. It's just like just far enough away from that it's not. But anyway.
Yep.
In the coming month, it's very clear that everyone kind of expects them to get married, which Pierre is like very neither here nor there about. And it all comes to a head at one final dinner before Prince Vasily goes to the provinces to take care of his estates, as well as to try to marry his son Anatoly to the daughter of Prince Bolkonsky. And they have this big dinner, and everyone's like, isn't this so cool? They're going to get married. They're all spending the dinner watching the two, and the two are, Helena and Pierre just basically sitting there in silence. Everyone retires. They go away. Everyone commenting on how amazing this marriage is going to be as the two of them continue to say nothing about it, discuss things in the corner. And then eventually, after much, Vasily and the other members who are still remaining kind of like, what are they doing? What are they getting up to? Finally rush into the room and congratulate the two of them on their marriage when
they did it.
They did it, sitting there quietly. And within a month, Pierre is now suddenly married. And, Pierre and Helena are both married, and they have this amazing, so we're told, life. And we'll talk about his very positive reaction to this later.
He's so helpless, but he is really probably the funniest character in the book, because he's the main character to which things just kind of happen to. He doesn't cause anything to happen. Things really only happen to him, and it's entertaining.
Speaking of, it's just a slight note. There's nowhere. I don't think we're going to take this anywhere, but it's just something that I cannot let go of. And as we talked about earlier, we really need to institute a Sweet Home Alabama meter, because there's a point when Pierre is thinking about Helena and what he thinks of her, and at some point in the middle of a lot of other thoughts, he notes like, oh, well, Helena is so beautiful, but there was that rumor about Anatoly, her brother, being in love with her and her being in love with him. And, surely, et cetera, et cetera. And maybe in another book, I'd be like, well, that's just salacious society rumor. But coming from Mr. Cousinhood is a dangerous territory. I'm not putting anything past Tolstoy right now. I don't know what to do with that. I just...
Arrested Development could never...
Too bad we can't change our theme music to the Arrested Development music.
Maybe we
for
can.
Various reasons. Well, look into the copyright. I'm sure it's not that expensive. So following that, after the marriage, Vasily goes into the provinces to take care of his estates, and as well as get his son to try to marry Prince Bolkonsky's daughter, Princess Maria. And as soon as Prince Bolkonsky gets the letter from Vasily noting that he's coming to meet him, first of all, Bolkonsky's pissed. He does not like Vasily, and ever since he's been maneuvering in society as of late, he gets the sense that Vasily is just kind of a someone who is trying to get ahead and does not respect him, and is in fact quite mad about this whole thing. And it's instantly obvious to everyone in the room as the letter's being read that Vasily is coming to try to marry his son Anatoly, to Bolkonsky's daughter, Marya. So things are not going great at the estate Bald Hills. You might recall, Prince Andrei's wife, the pregnant, as she's often called, the little princess, or Lisa, she lives in fear of Prince Bolkonsky. He is, as you probably recall, not a very nice man.
Pretty bad father.
Pretty bad, pretty awful father.
Probably worst father of the year.
Yeah,
is I think what his mug says.
And I think he would be proud of that for some reason.
Unfortunately,
I think it said of their relationship, the little princess lived at Bald's Hill under a constant feeling of fear and antipathy for the old prince, though she was not aware of the antipathy because the fear was so predominant that she could not feel it. On the prince's side, there was also antipathy, but it was smothered with contempt. So not great relationship there.
No.
And as they begin to arrive, Princess Marya is kind of excited because she's, as Tolstoy will not let us forget, not very attractive, and she's not had a lot of suitors. And so Madame Bourrienne, who is their sort of French maid helper, I don't think I have her exact title in the household, but she just is their sort of helps them out with whatever they want. And they get ready for his approach, and Vasily comes, and again, Bolkonsky is even more mad when he arrives, and Anatoly, who is, handsome, but as it's repeatedly hit home, not very smart. As evidenced by when they arrived, and Bolkonsky asks him, "So where are you serving?" And Anatoly has to turn to his father and ask him in what regiment he's serving in. Notably, Anatoly had just been picked up from this regiment by his father to come here. So as they arrived, Marya is really excited to meet him. She's getting ready. And this is a bit older, or a bit of a longer thing, but I really cannot get over how much Tolstoy is just you really have to, he will not let up on Marya not being attractive.
No, he will
so
not.
In this scene, Madame Bourrienne and Lisa, the little princess, are trying to dress her for her meeting with Anatoly. And it said, she flushed, her beautiful eyes faded, her face became covered with blotches, and with that unattractive expression of a victim which most often lingered on her face, she gave herself into the power of Madame Bourrienne and Lisa. The two women concerned themselves, in all sincerity, with making her beautiful. She was so plain that the thought of rivalry with her did not occur to either of them. They therefore undertook to dress her up in all sincerity, with that naive and firm conviction of women that clothes can make a face beautiful. No, really, ma bonne amie, this dress won't do, Lisa said, looking sideways at the princess from a distance. Have them bring the maroon one you've got there. Really? Why, this may just be the deciding of your fate in life. And this is too light. It won't do. No, it won't do. What would not do was not the dress, but the face and whole figure of the princess. But neither Madame Bourrienne nor the little princess sensed that. It seemed to them that if a blue ribbon was put in the hair, done up high, and a blue scarf hung down on the brown dress, and so on, all would be well. They forgot that the frightened face and figure could not be changed, and therefore, no matter how they changed the frame and decoration of that face, the face itself remained pitiful and unattractive. So,
pretty brutal.
Yeah, that's not even the end of that. It goes for another page.
Yeah, it really did.
So I don't have anywhere to go with that. That's just Tolstoy will not let you forget. So they go and have their meeting, and all three of the young women are entranced with Anatoly, who was hot but not smart. And Anatoly, very, he looks at Marya and says, well, she's not very attractive, but she's pretty rich, so that's cool. But he's really into Madame Bourrienne, who is, in fact, very attractive, such that the next day when Marya goes to her father, Bolkonsky, and he says, hey, look, he's proposed marriage, or Vasily has proposed Anatoly marry you, but I hold to the belief that it's your right to choose, which is apparently the only good thing he really has going for him as a father. You give it a couple hours and then come here and tell me what you think. And as she leaves, she happens to find Madame Bourrienne in Anatoly's arms. They run off, and then becomes a whole thing where she goes and tells Vasily and her father that she does not want to marry Anatoly, and instead resolves that although she would like to seek earthly happiness, as she talks about much in this passage, she decides she's going to choose a godlier way, and instead of choosing her own earthly happiness, seek a godly happiness and try to find happiness for her friend/servant, Madame Bourrienne, which is where I leave that scene. And following that, we go to briefly the Rostovs, who received news of their son, Nikolai, who you might recall last time was wounded in battle. They sent him a lot of letters and 6,000 rubles, from which point we go to out in Austria at this point, following up on their defeats, some victories. And Nikolai receives this letter. He goes to his friend Boris to go pick up the letters and the rubles, and a lot of things are going on. The long and short of what happens in this scene is that the emperor and both the Tsar and the Austrian emperor are here to oversee the battles after some recent victories. And while they're getting ready for these battles, Nikolai sees the emperor or the Tsar and is entranced. He's like fallen in love, and he's watching the emperor. He thinks, I would like love to die for this man. I could think of no better fate than to die in his service. And he begins to fantasize about not just killing a French officer in his presence, but rather slapping the man and delivering some kind of speech that will bring the emperor's respect, or something similar to the imaginings of Pierre earlier in this book. Tolstoy is not very kind to women in his book. However, I find he does capture imaginative young men fairly well. It makes sense, I guess, for him as a writer. So as they're getting ready, Nikolai, he's not seen Boris in many months, and they have a conversation while they're there, and they have an argument, in fact, where one of the things that the Nikolai's family sends him is a letter to become part of the staff office, or the team of staff officers. And he says, I'm not going to be anyone's lackey. I'm here to make my own fate. And Boris kind of takes offense to this, saying like, okay, well, you got a family that'll send you 6,000 rubles at a time. I don't have anyone like that. I need to go find myself a staff position. So he goes off and finds his friend Prince Andrei, the son of Prince Bolkonsky, to go help him place. And there's a whole politics. The army continues from here for some time, until we get to the actual coming battle itself. At this point, the assumption of the Austrians and many of the Russian generals is that the French and Napoleon are retreating, that they are no longer there, that they are on their final legs. And they put forth a battle plan which more or less relies on that assumption. Now, there are a couple among this group, notably General Kutuzov, who don't think that's the case and object to it, but they're totally overruled. And they go forth in the battle, and they march forward, and they're ready for a glorious victory. Nikolai, the night before, although he sees the French lighting fires and notes that to some generals, they kind of overlook it, and they're like, well, that's just them trying to trick us. And Nikolai says, okay, great, perfect. I can't wait to fight them in battle tomorrow. However, the next morning, when they are marching out, we note that Napoleon's watching them from the distance and is completely calm, and it's noted that, well, they're more or less doing what he guessed they were going to do, and has his troops go into action. So as the Russians and the Austrians and some number of Czech and Polish soldiers are getting ready, the French appear a mile and a half forward of where they're supposed to be, and they begin to charge. And almost immediately, I think it's the left flank, which is where General Kutuzov is, immediately breaks. And they begin running. And in an attempt to rally the troops, Kutuzov turns to Andrei, or Prince Andrei, and says, look, do something. And Andrei picks up the fallen standard, the flag of the regiment of the soldier we're carrying has been killed, and begins to rush forward. And some number of troops follow him as they rush towards the embattled artillery. And as he runs forward, he suddenly feels like he's been hit in the head, and he falls to the ground, and wondering why he can't get up, stares at the sky and kind of passes out. At the same time, Nikolai is sent to this side of the battle. The right flank has not encountered the French yet. And as he's going there, we see scenes of battle, of soldiers running away, of dead and wounded, and Nikolai's fears, until finally he finds the Tsar, who's supposed to deliver a message to, but he's so self-conscious that he can't do it, and he walks away, and then goes to basically sit among the dead and wounded, not sure what to do next. And in our last chapter of closing out this book one, we come back to Prince Andrei as he lies in the field dying, and Napoleon comes out to survey his victory much later in the day, and stands over Andrei and says, fine death. But Andrei, as he lays there, coughs, and Napoleon realizes he's alive and sends him to the medic, before later coming out to come back to him because he's surveying all his captured officers. And he stands before him and kind of induces Prince Andrei to say something. And then for so long, Prince Andrei has looked up to Napoleon. He's wanted to meet him. This is his hero. This is the man who's changing things. And as he stares at him, he can't muster up the feeling to say anything, not because he's afraid, but because he now sees Napoleon as a petty man. And as he was lying in the field, there could seem nothing better than the sky and gentleness. And now that he looks at him, Napoleon is not a mythic figure like he imagined, but just a petty man coming to see a small victory and something that he doesn't care about in the light of the great clouds he was looking at as he laid on the field. And as he passes into a fever, after Napoleon leaves, he begins to dream of life back at Bald Hills, of his wife, of his unborn son, of his father, and a quiet family life there. And that's as he has handed off to some locals to deal with him as he's unconscious and feverish. That's where we leave the end of book 1.
And we did it.
And we did it.
A fourth-ish of the way through?
Just about. So there's a lot to... There's a quick summary. A lot happened here. Is there anywhere in particular you want to start?
I will start at the beginning, I think. There's a lot to unpack in this chapter, to put it lightly. I saw a few connections to Anna Karenina and a few other connections even to Stalingrad, which we, of course, just finished reading for the podcast not too long ago. And if you haven't listened to that series, you might be interested if you're enjoying War and Peace. So, not to start on Stalingrad, I'll start with Anna Karenina. Prince Vasily, to me, is Stiva from Anna Karenina. There's just so many characteristics, mostly the fact that he is bad at everything. Like, he's good at doing bad things, is what he's good at. Mm-hmm. He's not good at doing anything good. And I don't mean doing things well. I mean, he doesn't do anything morally good throughout the entirety of the story. And where I really see this connection is in the sort of intentionality of it, which is what I think a really big part of it is for Tolstoy. So this quote that you started to mention, it goes, Prince Vasily was not a man who deliberately thought out his plans. Still less did he think of harming anyone in order to gain his own ends. He was simply a man of the world who had got on and to whom getting on had become a habit. Various plans and schemes for which he never rightly accounted to himself, but which constituted his whole interest in life, were continually forming in his mind, arising from the circumstances and the persons he met. And it goes on to describe how he doesn't, he's not deliberately using people for his own gain. That's not what he's necessarily setting out to do. It's something that just kind of happens to him as he stumbles through life, which maybe that is how he views what it is he's doing. I think it probably is. I think it's his perspective on the life that he leads. But to me, this is just echoes of Stiva from Anna Karenina all over. And it really brings up this question pretty early on in the book that I think we will get to more later, is evil always a deliberate act that somebody does? Does somebody always set out to do evil? Can evil be something that kind of just happens by circumstance? And how do we perceive it? That's another question that I've started to sort of note on this second part. And I have some things to back it up, but I'll just briefly put it out there that there's this sort of lack of perception of people in this family when they're in rooms. There's all this commentary on people not really being able to see them. And this goes into some, there's a lot of people that have conceptualized evil as a lack of goodness or an absence of goodness or just kind of an absence in general. And you can do some more reading on that if that sounds interesting. Many people smarter than me have written on that. But what I noticed as someone who just likes to read is that Tolstoy is writing this family in this way that very deliberately shows that they have this sort of absence that can be associated with evil. And it's much different, I think, than how you would maybe normally think about somebody being evil. I think it's something to me that can be learned from Tolstoy and can be applied to now, which is that evil isn't just like a Nazi. There are more levels of evil, and it's not always clear that it is something that you are doing that could be evil. There's something to be kind of gleaned, I think, from Prince Vasily, because it's a characteristic that a lot of people kind of can pick up along the way in life, I think.
To very, very badly butcher one of Kant's imperatives to treat people as ends in and of themselves. The entire family is very much treats people instrumentally. that Vasily, to your point, everyone around him, even his own kids, are people who are not pawns. He doesn't think of them that way necessarily, but that's what he does, even if he's like a likable person in and of himself. And sorry, Kat is decided that she would like to hang
That'll be
out.
fun for you to edit out every day.
Yeah. For example, when he's talking to his daughter at one point, it's noted that he addressed his daughter in the careless tone of habitual tenderness, which is adopted by parents who have been affectionate with their children since childhood, but with which Prince Vasily only approximated by means of imitating other parents. And paying attention to how parents treat their kids is something I've been noting a lot as we go through here.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, for example, of like compared to Balkonsky, who is a bad, like I'm not going to make any bones about it. He's a bad father. He's like a really shitty person to Maria. You also, I would give him the credit of giving Maria agency over her marriage. And he's like, whatever, I'll give you my opinion, but it's up to you. Whereas Vasily is kind of like, he doesn't say his daughter has to marry Pierre, but it's there by implication that she should marry Pierre, such that, you know, their marriage is declared without Pierre or Helena, them both never acknowledging him. Right. They're like doing that, or Helena, we don't really get as much into her internal life, which based on how much we hear about her body, it's shocker that Tolstoy doesn't give her any internality, internality, at least not internality. What's it? Interiority, at least yet in the book. But, you know, when we go to Anatoly, for example, when he's meeting Maria and Madame Bourrienne, he's like, oh, well, you know, Maria isn't much of a looker, but she's pretty rich, but man, Phil surely take Madame Bourrienne with us. You know, it's a family people, at least father and son, who see people instrumentally.
You'll get more interiority of her later, I think,
Mm-hmm.
if I'm remembering correctly. There's definitely more scenes where she's kind of involved in. But yeah, it's interesting.
Right. Speaking of, do you mind if we move over to Pierre and Helena's relationship for a second?
I would really love to.
So I know we went over it very briefly and kind of portrayed it as something that just kind of happens, but it's something that just kind of happens, and it should be noted the characters are aware that it's just kind of happening, or at the very least, we are getting this mostly from Pierre's perspective, who is very aware that it's just kind of happening too. What Matt said about things just happening to Pierre. I don't remember if I wrote this down. Oh yes, sorry, go on.
I guess I should clarify. Like, I don't know that it's things that are necessarily happening to Pierre, or if that is the way the narrator frames Pierre's perspective, where it seems like things are just happening to him, because he acknowledges that he knows he's doing something that's going to cause people to feel this certain way, and he has actually a very good sense at this point that what he's doing is causing people to look at him a certain way, and therefore he feels that sort of obligation. And, you know, if he was a little more active, he could have kind of got himself out of the situation before he was in too deep, but he doesn't.
Yeah, but he doesn't.
And that's fun for us. So
when he's sitting at the dinner table before he and Helena are pronounced married, you know, he's already kind of aware that they're going to be pronounced married soon, or he should say, well, I'm kind of your fiance now, right? And he thinks all of this had to be so and could not be otherwise. Therefore, there's no point in asking whether it's good or bad. It's good because it's definite, and there's no more of that old tormenting doubt. And like later on, he thinks, it's too late now. It's all over. And anyway, I love her, thought Pierre, which is definitely how you want to approach a marriage. I'm not a marriage counselor, but I've never been married, but I'm assuming that's only the best way to approach thoughts of marriage.
Sorry, I'm not going to read the lyric, but Pierre really, you know, I've been having this discussion in our Discord, link in the show notes if you want it. And you don't want this discussion, but you might want our Discord. I don't know. I've been having this discussion on which Weezer album Tolstoy's characters would respond to. And I got to go publicly on record with my boldest claim, which is that Pierre is absolutely Pinkerton era Weezer. And now this joke is going to land for maybe like one person in our audience. But for that one person, I want you to know, I see you. And Pierre also sees you. And Tolstoy also, it confirms my suspicion that he was Pinkerton Weezer too. And so I've just got some thoughts on that. So find me in Discord. As
a non-Weezer listener, is Pinkerton kind of the flop era?
Well, it's kind of the beloved flop era.
Interesting. Okay.
You know, it flopped at the time, but it's become kind of an emo precursor that's been almost reclaimed, even though it has some problematic moments.
All right. Fair enough.
Now, whether Pierre is reclaimed or not, I don't know. But sometimes I look at those lyrics and I think, wow, Pierre probably could have written this if he wasn't a Russian aristocrat.
Right.
So
and
it's just my ploy to get Rivers Cuomo on the podcast.
All right. Well, we'll keep on trying.
We'll keep on trying.
We're on TikTok now, so I think he's on TikTok too. I've been told. But yeah, he's things happen to him, and he doesn't question it too much. To back away from the marriage real quickly, after he is newly ingratiated to society in Moscow, it's noted that everyone puts a lot of effort into convincing him that he was very sad about his father dying, who he again barely knew. And now they're suddenly his friends, and he thinks it's so natural that they should like him that he doesn't really question why they're suddenly so nice to him. So he doesn't have a lot of critical thought about the position he now occupies in society, whether that be because of his money and the way people treat him for it, or in relation to his marriage. Other than the fact that he's like, and I think we mentioned this briefly, but I should say that him being horny for Helena is not one thing. Like, that's an ongoing. You hear a lot about her body from Pierre, and it's real uncomfortable.
Yeah. I mean,
like,
but
if
he's
this
not.
is written now, I'd be like, come on, dude, really? Like, I've read authors who write like that, and it's like, really? And it's even stranger when you hear it from Tolstoy.
Yeah, I think for Pierre, it's kind of he already has this realization that he doesn't really want to be married to her. He just thinks that she's attractive, and that's his dilemma in much fewer and less horny words. But then you also see right after they kiss where Pierre says that he's shocked by the change in her face, by its unpleasantly abandoned expression. And I note here that this is the first sort of indication of absence that's noted in the Kuragin children. And so this is my working theory on this family. And I'm paying more and more attention to how the families are connected and what sort of strands unite them, like what characteristics, what do they say that makes them family in the writing. And this is one of them. Abandoned expressions and absence and like not being visible. This is all something that can characterize them. So if you find any other ones that I don't mention on the podcast, let me know. Maybe it's not that important, but I found it. Can we talk about Bolkonsky for like a minute?
Let's talk about Bolkonsky.
Now, I realize that he is probably the meanest character in the novel. And there is probably a whole horde of Twitter psychologists that would just have an absolute field day writing like clickbait threads to get you to click on about this, about him and the various syndromes that he can have. However, the fact that he wanted Prince Vasily to not visit him so bad that he had his servants shovel the snow back onto the pathway that they had already shoveled off for him, just so he would have to drive his whole entourage through the snow path. Absolute W.
Yeah, there's a lot of moments where he's like obviously kind of a terrible person, but he gets lots of dubs. Like when he's like, Anatoly is so stupid. My daughter is, even though he treats her horribly, he's like, yeah, my daughter is so much better than him. Why must young women be married off in such a fashion anyway? He's not thinking about it for their own agency, but he's like, this whole system is stupid. Whatever, it's her choice, but if it was up to me, no one need to be married off in such a fashion.
He's probably the best judge of character that we've seen so far.
Yeah.
But then, he doesn't like Prince Vasily, and he's absolutely right for not liking him. He knows that Anatoly's looking at the maid. Like, the first step in the room, he thinks, well, he's going to bang the maid. And he almost does.
But also, as a side point, this is I think his one moment of being not a good parent, but a sympathetic father at all, is when he is talking to Maria about her, it's your decision, whatever. He's like, yeah, if you want to go married, you can go off and take Madame Borean with you and she'll be his wife. And then he sees that Maria reacts badly to that. And he's like, sorry, that was a bad joke. But Maria later acknowledges that he was basically correct in that, it was like a bad joke of him correctly analyzing what Anatoly actually is interested in here.
I don't think he's being sympathetic. I think he's trying to torment her. However,
he is, but he's also
right.
He's right, but he apologizes after he sees that she doesn't like it, which is like, I think
but
the only
not
time.
Really.
Not really. I mean, it's you can read into it your varying levels of genuineness, but like, yeah, he's to your point about him being a good judge. He's the only one. Everyone else is indebted to court society and looking in caring about their positions and who's related to whom and who has money and et cetera, et cetera. What is that? What's that Bowling for Soup song? High school never ends, except It's the Russian aristocracy never ends.
Yeah,
yeah. No, it did actually pretty violently, but
it did pretty violently. Yeah,
that's actually pretty famously. It ended not well for the aristocracy.
Yeah, I think Bowling for Soup had to cut that out of that song.
But yeah, and just as a note about Maria, I think it's she gets a lot of time to herself to discuss. First of all, that she's, as you mentioned before, very religious and is mostly concerned with doing right by God first of all. But then she secretly, in her heart of hearts, she wants the earthly delights of a marriage and kids and what Tolstoy imagines all women want. I imagine. Well, I don't have to imagine. We can read his later works. Sure. That's what he thinks. But later on, when it becomes clear that Anatoly really is interested in Madame Borean, then she's like, well, I'm going to give up my earthly desires for now and pursue the happiness of my friend / servant.
I need to read the book again before I pass judgment, but there is just, I don't know. It's kind of, I think it's more of a mask. I think she uses religion as a mask for the fact that she is severely emotionally stunted by having a horrifically abusive father, which is kind of the great sadness of the whole situation. That's my initial guess here.
Yeah, I could scan.
I mean, I've read the book already, but it's been like a little bit.
Sure. Is there anything else you want to talk about through the Bolkonsky / Kuragin situation, or should we move on to
not really anything major? Just my, again, hammering home of absence when Anatoly approaches Princess Maria. She says that she still could not see him. It's mentioned so many times. And I think you're supposed to think like, oh, she thinks he's so attractive, which she does. But I think that's not doing her justice. I think.
Yeah.
There's more to it than that. So just something to note and to follow.
Okay, warfare. We have our favorite pair of friends.
We did peace. Now we do war.
We've got Nikolai, we've got Boris, we got Prince Andrei, Kutuzov. And so let's start off with the relationship between Nikolai and Boris, if that works for you.
Sure does.
Cool, because there is, so they become, at least for me, maybe more so, it's like the dichotomy here is more so between Nikolai and Prince Andrei. But Nikolai is, he was the student who decided to volunteer for the army, totally not because his best buddy Boris decided to it was Boris, because his best bud Boris decided to go into the Hussars. Well, decided because Prince Vasily helped him place in the Hussars. But he is ready to go to war. He's ready to fight. He's ready to die. When he sees the Tsar, he is described as repeatedly in love with the Tsar. He's imagining having moments of fitful emotion, and he's ready to kill, but that's not really what he was about. He wants to slap a soldier. He wants to show offense, and he wants to show his intellectual domination over the enemy in front of the Tsar. He wants to be not just a tough soldier. He wants to be someone who the emperor would keep close, and he's ready to do nothing more than die in the face of the emperor. Whereas a lot of the other characters, I mean, Andrei, we'll talk more about how his relations to the death and his own family. But and Nikolai is very naive and pure in that sense. When his family is like, oh, you should go to the general staff where it's less dangerous. You've been wounded already. Here's a recommendation letter for General Bagration. And he says, I don't need Binion's lackey. And, and in the next scene, Boris is riding away thinking angrily, like, how could he just throw that away? Maybe a family that will send you thousands of rubles. That's something you can just give up. But, the rest of us, well, we have to pay our bills more or less. So I don't know if I have too much beyond just the setting up Nikolai as a character who, at least in this part, is very, he's a young man in love with his czar, ready to fight, ready to die. No matter what the situation.
Two comparisons to draw. The obvious one is the Nikolai Boris comparison, or the differences between them, which to me, again, they literally are just modeling the behavior of their parents. Boris is doing exactly what he didn't like when his mom was doing it on his behalf, and now he's just doing it for himself, which I realize is supposed to be shown as kind of the lesser of the two approaches, but I get what he's saying. If you don't come from a rich family, that's just footing the bill for... I mean, 6,000 rubles is a ton of money. That's like a lot of money now. I can't even imagine how much that was back then. If somebody sent me 6,000 rubles, like, how many beers 6,000 rubles could buy in Russia? A lot of beers. That's not the point. The point is,
when we were in Russia, I think we got a week's stay in a hostel for 50,000 rubles. And that's before the economy got tanked by them invading Ukraine. So like, that's, that's a lot of money. Was it 5,000 rubles actually?
I think it was 5,000. I don't think it could have been 50,000. Yeah. That's like...
No, it wasn't 50. It was 5,000. I think it was 5,000 rubles that took us a week's stay in a hostel, like a nice one that had our own room. So like, that's a lot, not an insignificant amount of money, especially in an era when most people are like, a couple kopecks is going to buy you something good.
Yeah. So I get that this is the behavior that he's kind of exhibiting, and Nikolai, I understand why he's doing what he's doing as well, when he's kind of telling these war stories to Boris, and the exaggeration that sort of unintentionally seeps into his story, which is, if you read any story that has anything to do with war by Tolstoy, he always talks about how it sort of gets to be exaggerated, and he loves to build that up in comparison with the actual battle, which, as we will see later, is always a complete disaster and just complete chaos, and no one's really a hero by choice, only maybe by coincidence.
Right. I think what it's said about to your point, when Nikolai sits down to talk about the battle, the Schöngraben action in the last part, he told Boris and another comrade of theirs, Berg, he told them about the Schöngraben action in just the way that those who take part in battle usually tell them. That is, that they tell them in the ways that they would have liked them to have happened, the way they have heard others tell it, and the ways that it could be told more beautifully, but not at all the way it had actually been.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, to your point.
Yeah, basically his father at a dinner party. He wants to be the center of attention. And so you have a direct comparison. He is very much like his father. But then I think the less obvious comparison is him and Princess Maria. I think there is a comparison to be drawn there between war and peace. And when we're talking about love and attraction, and if I can assume the sort of stereotypical approach that one might, you would maybe expect that Princess Maria, right, would have this more emotionally charged sort of scene between her and Anatoly. And that's, of course, destroyed by his actions, which are pretty bad. But you get way more of this from Nikolai thinking about the Tsar. I mean, pages and pages and pages. Princess Maria just thinks like, yes, this guy's attractive. I would have kids with him. A little bit more flowery language. Sure. Nikolai is like, I would throw myself into a burning fire with everybody from France if it would just make this man smile. It's the most dramatic, over the top, just crazy feelings jammed into like a bunch of pages and spread throughout the latter half of this sort of part that we're on. And so I think there's this emotional connection between war and peace, and it's different than you would expect. I think that's what it's supposed to highlight.
I think Do you mind if we move on to? I want to talk about that theme, which I've been thinking about a lot ever since you mentioned, is the like the place between the so-called great men of history and the way history really is formed.
Sure.
Because I just a transition here. So obviously Nikolai is obsessed with the emperor and would do anything for him. And I think at some point the battle that happens here is somewhat laconically referred to as the Battle of Three Emperors between Napoleon, the Tsar, and the Austrian Emperor. So it's technically them, but also, I mean, Napoleon is the most active out of the three of them. The other three emperors, for the most part, their position is really just ordering the troops forward, watching the troops. When Kutuzov is, for example, they're preparing for to fight the French troops, which they believe that are more or less a reserve force after a retreat. Kutuzov is getting his troops in place, and the Tsar comes up and says, "Hey, why aren't you advancing? Why aren't you fighting?" And Kutuzov says, "Well, I mean, I haven't gotten all my troops in place yet." And the Tsar is like, "This isn't the Tsaritsyn field. Not ready to go to parade rest. Go fight." And then Kutuzov says, "Well, it's exactly why we're not at parade rest. Why I'm waiting for my troops so I can carry out the plan." And then is overruled by the emperor. But despite all spending so much time with the plans of generals and the desires of emperors, what happens is the French emerge because of Napoleon's scheming to a degree, much forward from where they're expected to be. And instantly all of the many pages, probably 20 something pages of planning, getting ready, just thrown into the pyre of history as the French and the Russian and Austrian troops panic and run, and destroys the whole thing. And all the scheming of the great men is just put to rest by one guy yelling, "They've got us now!" And
So
pretty
I
much
don't
throwing
even think
a
it
cog at the
was.
wheel.
I think the main part of it wasn't even that Napoleon did anything good. It was the fact that the way the fog was arranged on the battlefield, the Russian and Austrian troops couldn't see anything, but Napoleon could see exactly where they were moving.
Yeah. Yeah. Sorry, I found the quote I was talking about, the so-called Battle of Three Embers. As in a clock, the result of a complex movement of numberless wheels and pulleys is merely the slow and measured movement of the hands pointing to the time. So also the result of all complex human movements of these 160,000 Russians and French, all the passions, desires, regrets, humiliations, sufferings, bursts of pride, fear, rapture, was merely the loss of the Battle of Austerlitz, the so-called Battle of Three Emperors, that is, a slow movement of the world historical hand on the clock face of human history. I don't know if I had too much beyond that point. Just the as will be hammered really home by Prince Andrei's encounter with Napoleon, the pettiness and smallness and of so-called great men in the face of history itself and the way it's made. Also contrasting against the way that those individual men who make history or people who make history conceive of those so-called great men. Case in point, Nikolai.
Yeah, it is. I think the watch face is a good comparison because, like, if you ask somebody what time it is to generally give you an hour, maybe some minutes, nobody would tell you the seconds, but really the seconds are what make up everything else. And it continues to go further and further and further down. And I think you're right that that's what he's trying to sort of hammer home, because when you try to conceive of a plan of war, right, we didn't really talk about this disposition that they had created at the war council, which was this ridiculously long thing that people were like falling asleep while they were reading about how the battle was exactly going to unfold. And the problem with that is you start kind of from the hour hand, you start from the top down. It's impossible to start from the bottom up because you have no way of knowing these sort of minuscule things and how they're going to relate to each other when one starts to impact another in a way that you didn't expect. And it might not just be fog, it might be something else. And that's what can kind of end up being really decisive.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah.
the more that you plan, the worse that it goes. And it made me think, I can't remember what the term was in Stalingrad when they're trying to think of, maybe it's like dynamic troop movement, fluid troop movement. I can't think of exactly what it is, but sort of the idea that troops are supposed to respond to their surroundings. And I think here the worst thing they could have done was attack. If they had just waited, they probably could have won. They could have had certainly a different outcome.
Right. Yeah. Speaking of Stalingrad, you mentioned you wanted to bring some of that in as well. Is there anything in particular you wanted to highlight?
I don't want to go too much into it just because it's not the main gist of this series, but
Hmm.
there was a little bit on troop movement, and then a little bit on the grain of sand and the insignificance. There's this quote that says, "Every general and soldier felt his own insignificance, was conscious of being a grain of sand in that sea of men, and at the same time felt his own might, being conscious of himself as a part of that great whole." And I think there's a reason that War and Peace was read in the Soviet Union. It's not just the story of great military victory, but it's also a story of, right, the everyday common soldier, these sort of common small whatever kind of actions that make you think, how could you write a whole novel based on these things? And that's what's important to Tolstoy, and I think that that's also really what's important to Grossman. And that sort of kind of forms a sense of nationality as well, or not just nationality, but a sense of community, maybe more broadly.
Mm-hmm.
So it's important. It's an important point.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, kind of. I don't know if this is entirely related, but speaking to like the places of the individual, I think Grossman is much more interested in the actual stories of individual people, getting into the vignettes of probably individual things he saw and giving them to characters in Stalingrad. You do kind of get that, especially in the battle scenes, especially when things are going wrong, and you get the many men wounded or dead, or the scenes of retreat, which are pretty harrowing in the same way that I was unpleasantly surprised by Tolstoy's horniness earlier. I was pleasantly surprised by his desire to really show like a war, not just I mean, to an extent, it's to show breaking down the conceptions of these characters, and keeping in mind that Tolstoy himself did serve in the military. That it's like kind of horrible. I mean, there's especially during the retreat, as the men are being cut down. There's one particular moment when we join a group of men running from French cannon fire, and they are being cut down. And one, Dolokhov is among them, and he runs onto some ice, and then he realizes that they cannot support any more weight than me. And there's an officer on a horse that realizes that too, and he's about to say, "Hey, don't go on the ice." But in graphic detail, it's described how a cannonball just takes this guy apart, and
Yeah,
he's
it
nothing
does.
but
Sure
a red
does.
mess. And then everyone freaks out that they cannon fire, and they run on, and it cracks, and they all begin to drown. Running like some being cut down by cannon or musket fire, others burning onto the ice and drowning, and it's unflinching in its description of those things. So, not that Tolstoy, it seems, was as interested in the individual stories of people. Certainly, the individual experiences, as seen through a group, are portrayed. Right? I mean, that's not just that battles happen, you win or you lose. It's battles happen, and then some parts of the battlefield, well, they're no longer parts of the battlefield. Either they've been advanced beyond, or they've retreated, or whatever. But they're still dead there. They're still wounded there, and if you don't have time to grab them, they're just sitting there, as told in my notes, crawling to go gather, to find something, find water, find each other, find whatever. But they're left alone, and presumably die or carry themselves away.
Yeah, he writes it well. I mean, it is definitely reminiscent of some aspects of Stalingrad to me. Not as I don't know. I don't want to say not as grand because it
Mm.
was for its time, but it different but similar.
Yeah,
That's descriptive, right?
that's it. Very.
Good.
Um, is there anything else you want to talk about, or should we move on to our final big moment, which is Andre meeting Napoleon?
Yes, let's.
All right. So, like we mentioned, Andre meets Napoleon by first Napoleon coming across him and declaring him a fine death, and realizing he was alive, and then adding him to his forces. But this is where, like you said, I remember this last episode of the episode before that. Tolstoy, not subtle about what he's trying to tell you here in a lot of ways. This idea of individuals and the so-called great men is hammered home, even though Napoleon, I would say, is given a fairly mm, up to this point, a fairly, like, not reverential, but he's very quiet. He looks upon the Russian troops, as the Russian and Austrian troops, as they're approaching, and doesn't even say anything. He just holds out a glove or something similar to signal that the troops should advance, and he's very dignified in the sword. But when he comes to see Andre looks at him and sees nothing but a, quote, a petty man, a petty, small, insignificant man, as he looks in his eyes.
Yeah, I think it just Andre's near death experience really did that to him.
Yeah,
Kind of a turning point for him, I think.
sure.
Kind of was more interested in glory and vanity and things associated with that, but after almost bleeding out on the battlefield, I think it gives him a little bit different perspective on life. And I think that just to compare the sort of vision that he sees on the edge of death, where he's able to appreciate just sort of the vastness of the universe, to kind of come back down and you see Napoleon and you're like, oh, it's just a guy. It's not that impressive.
I mean, the night before in the dark, he's standing there and he thinks of his family, he thinks of his wife, he thinks of his unborn kid, and he thinks, I'd trade that all for a moment of glory. But he has that moment of glory. He grabs his standard, he jumps off his horse, he charges the enemy, he's shot down. And then, I mean, it feels like nothing in comparison to going back home and just being a quiet life.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. It's not that deep. Tolstoy pretty much says what he means here.
Yeah. The deep part will be sort of seeing how Andre copes with it for the rest of the book.
Yeah.
But Napoleon's really not anything special, is what we're seeing so far.
Mm-hmm. You know, he's a general, he's dignified, but I mean, nothing special.
Not really.
You're here to hear first, folks. Napoleon, nothing special.
Nothing special.
Is there anything else you want to touch on before we finish up?
Oh, I am good. This was a good part. I enjoyed this part a lot.
There's a lot to touch on here. I feel like the first two episodes, I think we're trying to find our footing, especially on themes, but now I think we're starting to bring some things home, which we'll be talking about for quite a while.
Forever.
For quite a long time. Yeah.
We'll never stop.
Cool. Well, in that case, Matt, we no longer have at least a one to Yeltsin meter for you. However, what we do have is a zinger of the week.
Yep.
Section for you. So I'm going to ask you, Matt, what is the zinger of this week?
Well, I got to say, you stole my thunder a little bit when you read my Prince Vasily zinger, but that's okay because it was hilarious. So in lieu of that absolute zinger, because that was probably the best one, I will submit to you a small quote that we did not get to discuss, but that we will be talking about in our War and Peace reading group that we're going to be running for our patrons starting at the end of January. The scene between Kutuzov and the Emperor, where he tries to raise concerns, and the Emperor replies, "My dear General, I am occupied with rice and cutlets. Look after military matters yourself." Kind of a zinger in a sort of unconnected way to Nikolai, who spent the whole part fantasizing about burning alive for the Tsar.
Yeah, yep.
A man who just wants to cry under a tree and eat cutlets. Which, honestly, I respect it.
Yeah, that's not what life's all about.
So how are you doing over there?
I only had one, unfortunately, Cerveza Alhambra, 1925. I'm not going to try to stumble through Spanish a year again. So I'm only maybe at 2, but just enough to go out through our complexity.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Cool. Well,
that's all right.
Matt, I got to ask you, because it's part of our script, although we will know, what are we covering next week?
Well, it's good you asked, because book 2 actually has 5 parts in it, so it was going to be maybe a little confusing if you were a silly fool and thought we were going one part at a time. No. We are reading parts 1 and 2 of book 2 for next episode. A little bit longer on the read side, but pretty good. And, each book ends up being about 300-ish pages, at least in my edition. So we're still kind of working around that 100-page a week an episode goal, which is what we had set out to do.
That is the goal.
And you'll get a break in the epilogues. I mean, come on, those are short-ish.
They're quick-ish for War and Peace.
Yeah, for War and Peace, yeah. Before we let you go, we want to extend a sincere thank you to all of our current patrons. We've got Jeff, Madeline, Ann, Janice, Daniel, Darren, Daniel, Paige, Jesse, Lou, Irini, Brandon, Allison, Cole, Elise, Mysterious, Donor Dude, Joanne, Yitza, Alex, Stephanie, Eli, Caitlin, Brett, Isaac, Austin, Zachary, Pack Rob, Maya, Amanda, Blake, Shannon, Elizabeth, James, Ben, Khalil, Natalie, John, Amanda, Yulia, M. Nikolaevna, Danielle, Banana Karenina, and JG. Podcasting isn't free and grad school doesn't pay very well, so if you're interested in joining with our current patrons to keep the show running, take a look at our Patreon at patreon.com/tipsytolstoy. The music used in this episode was Soviet March by Toasted Tomatoes. You can find more of their stuff on toastedtomatoes.bandcamp.com and also on YouTube under the same username. If you're looking for other places to find us, you can also follow us on Instagram at Tipsy Tolstoy Podcast or join our email list on our website, tipsytolstoy.com. You'll hear from us again soon.